look at the LPA a little bit, then Bosnica, and then how I see this moving forward. So Libyan conflict, as we all know, is an African issue with profound consequences, and primarily for Libyans, of course, but also for the greater region. And so Morocco has been in a position where it needed to react to events in 2011. And Moroccan foreign policy basically revolves around its soft power and revolves around diplomacy. So you can see this all over the African region, but particularly in Libya after the coup d'etat happened in 2011. There was no real love lost between Gaddafi and Gaddafi's regime in Morocco. They had years of tensions before that and just different policy aims in general. So after that happened, Morocco was very responsive to supported the Libyan people, believed in seeing a peaceful transition, and this was a pattern in the Arab Spring for Morocco because compared to other maybe more ideologically driven powers, it was a lot more pragmatic. Domestic concerns were immediately discussed, and so there's a difference in the level of animosity shown. And that's what happened in Libya. So we saw Morocco join the contact group for Libya, and because of the ethno-linguistic and centuries of connections between both countries, Morocco's positive neutrality approach was actually pretty productive for Libya. And then, so over the years between 2011 and 2015, when the LPA was signed, we saw a lot of polarization. We saw a lot of fragmentation, unfortunately. And so the democracy that countries wanted to see prosper in Libya, unfortunately, just did not occur. So Morocco started, negotiations started in the UN early 2015 about how to make this Khairat agreement come along. And then Morocco shifted from an accompanying partner to more of a co-mediator in that regard. And it was a great opportunity to unite the institutions, and about 40 meetings were held from Ghadames to Geneva to Skhirat. And it was a particularly necessary moment during the LPA signing, just contrary to maybe perhaps some revisionist perspectives. We saw in late 2014, we saw Gaddafi start his Operation Karama. We saw the November 2014, the Supreme Court in Libya call the HOR in Tobruk unconstitutional. We saw loose coalitions start to prosper. So the LPA was an attempt by Morocco and other foreign powers in that period to unite institutions, to bring Libyans together around one dialogue, to make a Libyan-led, Libyan-owned approach. It was only going to be a first step, and it could have been a success because it was going to separate the extremist actors from the more moderate ones. Unfortunately, the agreement had gaps. So these gaps were exploited after the agreement was signed in December 17. We saw Haftar immediately rejected. We saw Aguila Saleh rejected, but then not rejected. And it was just, it was a really blurry picture in terms of how it was actually going to function. So while there was an agreement on the desire to bring institutions together, there was an agreement on who would be involved, etc. And this could be also linked to Libya's past. Unfortunately, with Gaddafi, he didn't leave any political entities. He didn't leave any institutions. Political parties were banned. Things were done through ad hoc popular committees, through diktats from the top. So they weren't really accustomed, perhaps, to a more regimented, more structured sort of way to do things, unfortunately. And then, so then the LPA was signed, it was exploited. We saw two PC members start boycotting, Omar al-Aswad from Zintan, Ali Farj Qatarani from the eastern side. So it started to lose that teeth that initially international parties wanted. And so US official in that period said, when you drive on ice, you accelerate, you don't press on the brakes. And that was one of the reasons the LPA was so necessary, and has actually created institutions which are still valid now, like primarily the Government of National Accord, which has the Presidency Council, which has the High Council of State. So these two entities are still relevant now and will be most likely part of any future solution. The parties that have been, who have risen through the LPA are most likely going to be involved moving forward. So Libyan representatives can adjust the LPA as they see fit, amend it as they see fit. And so after it was signed, we saw Haftar engage in the 2016 oil crescent. He went and on an offensive, and then in 2019, another offensive on Tripoli, which coincidentally happened at the same time as a international convention. If it was a coincidence or not, it's relatively dubious because there is perhaps a pattern there. And then, so we saw the Berlin conference occur after the LPA was signed. Morocco was excluded, which was an interesting decision considering Morocco's inherent connection to Libya and connection to the Sahelo-Maghrebian region. And the Republic of the Congo was invited. So that sort of could give you an idea how Morocco felt about that. And but throughout the course of this conflict, Morocco has been on good terms with the GNA, but has also kept open channels with the East, because to be a mediator, you have to be able to balance both. And then, so that's what we saw now more recently with Bosnica, which was an effort to combat extreme polarization. So because Haftar cares is perhaps more legitimized by conflict than he is by peace, and Ghila Saleh is perhaps the reverse. So there were efforts to invite Ghila Saleh and Khalid al-Mishri to Morocco in early July. Ghila Saleh was meant to come here after he visited Algeria, but Algeria told him they just canceled the meeting ostensibly on the fact that Ghila Saleh was very sympathetic to the Egyptian proposal, which was going to marginalize Algeria's role and was going to lead, according to Tebboune, to a Somaliization of Libya. So Ghila Saleh came to Morocco instead. There have been meetings since then with the HCS and the HOR. We've seen they came here at the invitation of Habib al-Malki, who was the Speaker of Parliament here. And they started discussing on how sovereign positions should be allocated. So they used the LPA, the Libyan political agreement, which is still a legitimate framework. And they used Article 15 particularly to see how they were going to allocate these sovereign positions. Unfortunately, questions remain about whether if these talks are actually representative. So any long-term solution for Libya is going to require diversified buy-in. It's going to require actors who actually have interests on the ground to be invited. And there were some questions about people who were invited to, was not only Bosnica, but also Montreux, also Egypt, also Geneva, whether these parties are actually the parties that should be invited, and whether are they just being opportunistic, or are they just trying to buy exposure just in case they're marginalized moving forward. So that's why, to go back to Jalal, I wouldn't necessarily call it pessimism as much as I would call it reservedness, and I share that reservedness with him, because any solution that's going to happen in Tunis next month is going to have to not only unite all these disparate initiatives, but unite all these disparate institutions and in different agendas and different foreign actors. It's also going to have to deal with the on-the-ground dynamics where you see mines still being planted in Sirt, you still see movements, you see the Sirt-Jufra line constantly being consolidated, you see the GNA's Ministry of Defense telling you that there might be an impending offensive. So there are a lot of things which perhaps wouldn't make someone necessarily optimistic, which is completely unfortunate. But to go back to what the UN, the Libyan representative to the UN said, multiple dialogues is better than multiple battlefronts. So as long as it does stay within this diplomatic track and we can actually see some movement in this regard, Morocco, that is its number one priority, is to see a Libyan-led, Libyan-owned approach, is to see it's because Libya is a brotherly nation, so Libya's prosperity is important. We need a stable region. In 2011, what happened in the crisis, there were 20 million weapons or something, which led to Tuareg members who were part of Gaddafi's military. They went to Mali, they tried to start an independent state. And extremism in the Sahel has only exacerbated since then. So Morocco has been affected already by this crisis, and moving forward does not want to see Libya and it's the brotherly nation caused to actually be suffering through something like this. But the facts remain what they are, and there needs to be more work done to unite all these initiatives and just make sure that they're actually going to be representative and they're actually going to be the solution that Libya can actually work with long term. And some actors from Morocco are perhaps not the most encouraging to work with. For example, Haftar and his reliance on Salafi Madkhalism doesn't necessarily link up with Morocco's Sufi, Malki religious spiritual diplomacy. So that could explain some of its reluctance not to support the UN recognized government. And so Morocco has always stuck with the UN recognized side of this. And it's also not on the same wavelength with Egypt when it comes to Libya, mostly because maybe Sisi has done certain things which aren't necessarily in Morocco's interests. So yeah, overall, we're going to see just the GNA. We might see a Khera 2.0. We might see a new presidential council with Sarraj's resignation. But unfortunately, if these solutions are actually going to bear fruit is what remains. And yeah, that's my part. I'm hoping for the best.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Nouman, for explaining us the Morocco's position and initiatives.